Thank you very much for your kind introduction and your kind words to former Prime Minister Abe. And we felt the very kind, warm feelings from the Australian people. Thank you very much. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank the Asia Society, Australia in particular, for your kind arrangement. I see the great interest turnout for today's event, both in person and also online. So Mr. Stuart Fuller, the chair, and Thomas Soem, the executive director, Sydney, and all the staff. So I thank you all for arranging this great event. I was looking forward to this. And I'd like to thank I look forward to the presentation by Ian and on the panel discussion with Debra and Richard and Yuko-san. So this topic is very important, and as Thomas said, Japan-Australia relations is very important across the board. But in particular, there's a great potential in this business sector, and I must say that the findings or policy recommendation that Ian made was quite articulate. He's saying that he's not academic, but he's been in this business world for so many years, knowing so much about Japan and Australia and the world and business and finance as well. So as I read his paper, I mean, I don't want to preempt his presentation, but I've got to say that the key point, the focus on energy transition and critical minerals, and the importance of the pragmatic project level collective partnership work in this field across the technology or financing and or the pragmatic implementation level. I think that is really what I feel is also important. And another keyword is a third paradigm, which will be valid in the next 10 years, which needs the mutual collaboration between those Australians who know Japan and those Japanese who know Australia. So I think those are the highlights that I understand of the recommendations, and they are really valid as I've been here for 3 years. Actually observing and listening to all the people, both from private sector and public sector, and both in New South Wales and the Northern Territory, which I'm in charge of. But the last but not least, the great thing about this kind of network is that as we think, we are implementing this vision together. And in particular, I'm very glad to have Richard of AJBCC and all the AJBCC members and all the academics, UTS is here, and university people are here. And because the key to make the policy recommendation implemented is to have the young Japanese and Australians who know deeply about each other. And I look forward to all of us working together to form a bit of a community so that we can make most of the opportunities and just we can raise those people who can actually implement fill in the gap and implement the ideas that Ian is going to present and we are going to discuss. So thank you very much.
So I might get straight into it. First question is to Ian, just to set the scene. So Australia and Japan's relationship has, I think, come to a height right now. Could you please, outline what has led to that point to today?
Yeah, well, I guess first and foremost is an economic relationship. So you saw Australia as a stable supplier of energies, mineral and food, and you see those joint ventures sort of starting in the 1960s. Then we saw that transition from about 2007 onwards, where companies like Kira and Asahi started to participate directly in the Australian market by acquiring majority shares or 100% of companies. And what I coined in our Australia-Japan investment report last year is this third paradigm of investment, which was, 2021 was the year of partnership. And it's really a partnership around new energy. And you'll see those, the report sort of details, there's probably about 50 of these collaborations about, you've never seen such a group of logistics companies, infrastructure providers, trading houses, shipping companies, technology companies, energy companies, all coming together in a kind of collaborative way. And we think Richard and others will speak more about that. So the economic base is strong and getting stronger. The geopolitical, well, we share the United States being our largest and most important ally, China as being our, if not our major second largest. So you've got kind of that context with both liberal democracies, so that kind of makes sense. You've got our participation in the regional trade agreements, and there's so many acronyms now. And in the paper, put them in a table. I couldn't. It was going to take too many words. But Australia and Japan are actively participating in trying to shape the regional sort of architecture, or with their policy things or structures. And then the other one I'd like to add is the social. And you're just saying through the holidays, all the Australians now have experienced Japan by going skiing, all the sporting tours, the social tours, and then you look at the hundreds and hundreds of, shimaitoshi, the sister city relationships. So there's a wonderful foundation, both the sort of political, economic, and community level. And they say, well, where to from here? We're going to talk about new energy transition. We're going to talk, Consul-General Kiya is already talking about critical minerals. We've got the reciprocal access agreement around defence, and so Richard Miles visiting that just in the last, 4 weeks, post-election. The other is, cooperation around cyber, artificial intelligence, and just an overall theme of decarbonisation. How do we use technology? How do we achieve that? Whether that's carbon offsets, is that going to be done locally, or can we do something on a kind of more regional basis? So lots of quite different but interconnecting and interdependent themes.
Yeah, and on the election, so we had an election in May. We now have a new government. So yeah, Richard, what do you see as the any change given the new Albanese government, and also in Japan with the Kishida government? What do you think would be any shake-up in this space, particularly for business?
Yeah. Look, I don't think we're looking at a shake-up as such, because a shake-up would presuppose a couple of things. Firstly, that there's some big problem that needs to be fixed. And as Ian's just said, I think one of the things that makes me constantly glad to be in this job at this time is there probably hasn't ever been a better time to be working on Australia-Japan relations in the last 30 years. And we do need to give some credit to the previous government for the fact that they built a very strong political relationship. Scott Morrison went to Japan for a visit during the COVID pandemic when he had to quarantine. When on his way back, that was noticed and welcomed. Dan Tehan, as Trade Minister, did the same thing. What's been really good, I think, is the fact that there's been a signal of continuity in that level of in that level of attention and that level of respect. We had the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister on an aeroplane to Tokyo, admittedly for the Quad meeting, but it was a fantastic opportunity to signal the importance of Japan. Within hours of an expedited swearing in. We've had Richard Miles go up there as well, and we know that there are other ministers who are interested in going. So I don't think there's going to be a shake-up, but I think that there is potential for a lot of deepening and building on what's gone before. And specifically, there are those areas. There's the area of clean energy transition. We now have an Australian government and a Japanese government which have very, very similar targets in respect of emissions reduction, which wasn't the case before. They're both prioritising that, but they both also know that they need to do that in a context where we can continue to guarantee the energy security of Japan, which is one of the biggest pain points for Japanese policy over the years. And so we've got governments, I think, that have got a lot of scope to work together in that space now because of the closer alignment of policy that's emerged. and maybe to put some flesh and attach some budgets, particularly to the to a lot of the agreements that have already happened between Australia and Japan in that space. And the other area I'd just like to touch on very briefly is also, and perhaps almost flowing from that clean energy transition story, is the fact that that's bringing Australians and Japanese companies together to talk about collaboration on technology in general, much more than probably has been the case over the years. And now we're seeing that interest and that understanding in Japan that Australia has great technology and ideas to offer in a range of different fields that are very relevant to Japan. Medical technology, AI, robotics and defense technologies, all sorts of different areas. And I think there's real scope for governments to get in behind that and have some initiatives that really cement that kind of collaboration, because it's really consistent with the strategic environment we're seeing, where people are now prioritizing relationships with people with whom they know that they share values. So we see huge potential for the commercial relationship to broaden and strengthen, not a shake-up, but certainly a lot of energy there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of positive opportunities there. But Ian, you mentioned in your policy memo, I'm going to quote, countries cannot take their strong and long-lasting relationship for granted. What do you mean by that? What do you see are the main challenges between the Australia-Japan relationship?
Yeah, I guess you've never seen such a combination of geopolitical events. Well, we always say that, but it probably happens every 10 to 15 years. But, we've had a period of, stability, whether that's in, economic terms, where the global economy's kind of been in a boom. There hasn't been any major. Suddenly, disruption of COVID, the rise of China sort of more asserting itself. I guess from Australia's perspective, even though Ukraine and Russia are a long way away, the impact of that is felt quite strongly in Australia. So, where do you, and then I guess the other thing was we had Donald Trump. Now we've got a Joe Biden. The United States is clearly very domestically focused at the moment, and we've got sort of swings. They play a very large, they're kind of the glue that keeps, I guess, the Asia Pacific side of it together. If America turns internally, that creates a vacuum. Pieces of the tectonic plates may tend to move around again. So, in those circumstances, business as usual is kind of not enough. You kind of almost got to all over the horizon what's coming. We've got some idea, but it's an opportune time for two friends who know each other to get to know each other even better.
And for industry and for business, Debra, what are the relationship opportunities there? What do Australian companies need to think about when they're expanding into overseas, and particularly Japan?
Thank you. Well, obviously the opportunities are driven by where we find ourselves, given the challenges we're facing into, not only around environmental commitments that we've made, decarbonisation, but also an ongoing need for Japanese to address the demographics of their own market and to expand and grow elsewhere and diversify their businesses. We need to be more conscious of security and setting up supply chains, and obviously sourcing energy and making sure it's strong and stable in the future and affordable. So you get those drivers, and you also have continuing trends of investment. And as Ian was saying early on, there's already very strong relationship from Australia, Japan, Australia in particular, in investment in Australia. So Ian and I looked back at the Herbert Smith Freehills report that actually brings to mind the paradigm, just to check out what the trends were over the last couple of years in investment. And I tried to pick out the ones that are driven by those particular pressures that we're seeing at the moment. So rather than go through the detail, I'd suggest and recommend that report to anyone who's interested. But just to go through maybe 9 of the 15 trends that I think are very, very important. There's decarbonisation clearly, and that's around, new energy, obviously hydrogen, ammonia, and methane, but methanol, but also you've got carbon technology. And carbon credits, you've got renewable energy, and you've got then you've got the critical minerals that we've been talking about, and battery raw materials, of course. The digital transformation is a huge area for investment growth. We've seen it, and it continues to grow, and that involves innovation. And there's a lot of, I think, it's already been said, but there's a lot of emphasis now on the complementarity between the abilities in Australia and the resources in Australia and what Japan needs. But I think the concept of partnership in innovation is a higher concept. It's about not buying from one source or selling to one source because of complementarity. It's about working together as partners to develop and grow. And so I think the partnership model is very important across the board. So you've also got Japanese interested in the startup ecosystem in Australia, and particularly around decarbonisation, ag tech, medical tech, AI, robotics. You've got commercial real estate after a long hiatus. You've got Japanese funds, particularly pension funds and real estate companies coming back into Australia, investing in that we're very strong in that area in Australia, and we offer very good opportunities. Residential property continues. Infrastructure, we've seen, continuation of Japanese investment into infrastructure, both social, particularly through PPPs, and economic infrastructure. But I think the change of trend in the economic infrastructure is the tendency towards putting forward unsolicited bids, if you like, because Japanese were disadvantaged in a way previously in economic infrastructure PPPs because they were often late to get to the consortium formation because of their lack of networks and so on in Australia. So that continues. Healthcare, obviously, is another trend, and the circular economy. We've got huge opportunities from particularly Japanese expertise and experience in waste management and conversion of waste to energy. How to deal with the hurdles that both Japanese and Australians face when they're looking to enlarge and diversify their investment. I think it breaks into a couple of areas. There's a mindset issue that I think is, we'll come to this later, I'm sure. It's about, from an Australian point of view, it's about making sure you're committed to the long-term relationship. Relationships with Japanese companies are not transactional. Or they need long-term commitment. They need your best people. They need absolutely put your best foot forward consistently, and to have a lot of patience and not to expect immediate gratification, I guess. But also there are some supports that you need from both sides, to help Japanese go into Australia and Australians to go into Japan. There's a lot of support available. There's government support. There's Austrade, obviously, does a terrific job. There's advisory firms that help. And I think they're all important. I think it's very hard to break through some of those, if you like, informal hurdles that the Japanese and Australians face when going into each other's markets. Advisory boards are a good way to help on both sides. But there's a new, I think it's very exciting to recognise that there's a new emphasis from both Australia and Japan on helping investment and trade, for that matter, in those new economies, in the new businesses, the startups, and so on. And so you've got, the J Bridge set up by JETRO in Japan that's helping in terms of smart city investment, healthcare investment, and so on. But you've also got, prefectural help like the Kansai startup hubs and so on. In Australia, and this is going to your report, Ian, I think it's important that we face into the fact that to make sure that we're successful in these areas of building these investment trends, that we clarify some of the rules around the FDI policies and so on, and also maybe help FIRB in their increasingly complex role, build their transparency.
Great. And on the sort of innovation side, I suppose that segues into my next question to Yuko. How would you describe the cooperation in research and development between Australia and Japan? Is it enough? Could there be more to be done there?
Thank you. Australia and Japan has had a very long history of scientific collaboration. This year marks the 42nd anniversary of the Australia-Japan Science and Technology Treaty. We have many good examples of collaboration between our two countries. Just looking at CSIRO, so Furukawa Battery commercialized CSIRO's Ultra Battery, which is used to power hybrid automatic vehicles, electric vehicles, and also Barley Max, which is a grain with cholesterol-lowering properties, was commercialized by Teijin and resulting in about 30 plus food products in the Japanese market. But the level of scientific collaboration between Japan and Australia is not proportionate to the successful economic and trade partnerships. For example, so putting it into perspective, if we look at publications, joint publications between the two countries, Japan is Australia's 7th collaboration partner. This is 2015 to 2021. And Australia is Japan's 11th. So we can work on that. Also, last week, CSIRO launched a new report on global megatrends. And on its address, our Chief Executive, Larry Marshall, mentioned that Australia's 30 years of uninterrupted success has not motivated us to innovate for the future. So Japan ranks number 3 in gross R&D expenditure, while Australia's investment in R&D has been falling. But it does not have to continue this way. There is an opportunity, a huge opportunity to work together in a new and reimagined partnership where we have dedicated bilateral science funds that will help tackle all the challenges that both countries face today. Science collaboration has been more prominently mentioned in recent high-level bilateral talks and Quad discussions, especially on ways to tackle the decarbonization, to tackle the extreme weather events, and also challenge the health threats like the pandemic. So again, we have this huge opportunity for Japan and Australia to work together to solve these challenges. And this is an opportunity that we must not miss.
And on the energy side, Ian, I think you outlined in your paper that 2/3 of Japan's energy consumption is supplied by Australia's fossil fuels. Now, both countries are pursuing this zero carbon emission target. How would that, this I suppose a question to anyone on the panel, but how does that alter the economic relationship between the two countries? Maybe if I want to start with you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting moment, and perhaps this is something that's written about enough in Australia. So this sort of, transition out of fossil fuels to transition down. If you look at the revenue that's generated, the industries, the capital that's been invested in the, for example, in Gladstone, the LNG, to just sort of shut that off and kind of move to hydrogen, has some sort of serious implications for Australia. So how do we replace that massive export? Secondly, the LNG and the coal, we have the national advantage. We've got it here. Hydrogen, not necessarily so. And as much as we would like to think we've got a special relationship with Japan and these 50 sort of starts of, if you follow the Nikkei, they're doing that in Canada. They were doing that in Russia. It's a global competition for this new energy transition. So we probably on the Australian side need to get moving on this, and I guess what Ukraine has shown is there's two things. There's going to be an acceleration of new energy, but also an extension of existing energy and the importance of that. And us as Debra touched on, stable and the pricing of that. And as much as a majority of Japanese companies have exited, particularly from thermal coal, they're still buying the same amount of thermal coal as they always did. In fact, they're buying more thermal coal than they ever did. So there's this sort of tension between where society would like everyone to get to and the reality of that. And unfortunately, the cobalt, I think 80% of it's in the Democratic People's Republic of Congo, which is always anything that starts with the Democratic People's Republic, you have to have a kind of question mark about. And so Australia has, when we talk about critical minerals, we're talking about battery raw materials in this transition and how important that is.
And what's that look for collaboration between the two countries, Yuko, to reach the zero emission goal? What's the scene like right now, and what are the opportunities?
So some of the options that we will have, it's like for decarbonizations, our industries is in agriculture. We can turn land use into negative emissions. We can work on transforming Australia's energy exports, upscale and value add the lithium and cobalt, titanium, rare earth that we have, and scale up our carbon capture and utilization storage technology to produce green hydrogen. We can also work together on AI and quantum to deal with the more decentralized and complex energy systems. And now CSIRO has, and to how to do this is, so for example, CSIRO has launched something called national missions. And these missions are large-scale scientific and collaborative initiatives that aims at making significant breakthroughs. And through these missions, we aim to accelerate the scale and the pace at which the nation can solve these challenges and unlock a better future. So we're working with our national missions partners. These involve the universities, the government, industry, and also international partners. We're accelerating towards net zero, to end plastic waste, and to transform raw minerals into value-add products, and to feed the world's hunger for renewable energy. So I believe that Team Australia, this approach of everybody working together, will be a very effective way, and to use Consul-General Kiya's words, the third paradigm, to work with Japan.
And I suppose, Richard, from a business perspective, what can business do to strengthen that relationship? And could you perhaps outline what the AJBCC is doing in that space too?
Well, in the energy space specifically, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is it's really important that business is included in the conversation between governments about the systemic aspects of the clean energy transition. Ian's obviously referred to the huge implications for Australian business and for Japanese business of this transition. And it's very important that if we're trying to make a transition out of something which is so big and so dominant and so lucrative into something which is really quite, at this stage, still in a formative phase, that we think very carefully about the systems and the policy frameworks that surround that as well. And that's why we've actually, from AJBCC, have proposed that to governments that they should hold a regular dialogue between Australia and Japan on the clean energy transition involving government, business and researchers, because there are very big implications. No hydrogen is currently shipped from one country to another on a commercial basis. There are technical challenges, standards haven't been developed and so on. How those frameworks are actually created can have a major bearing on how successful the trade is actually going to be. So, and it's very important that the practitioners are actually involved in that process. And this actually, to me, also takes us into sort of another part of what's explored in Ian's paper, which is about the broader implications of the Australia-Japan relationship. One thing that won't change between now and when we are in a clean energy world is that Japan will have a need to import energy in large quantities, and Australia will have a large amount of surplus energy if we can get it to the places we want to export it to. And the scale of that relationship, combined with the fact that Japan knows it can trust Australia to deliver over a long period of time without interruption, that's why we have such a dominant position in Japan's energy market, is because Japan feels comfortable in trusting Australia to deliver. That suggests that we've got a really good base to build a large-scale relationship in clean energy as well. And when we do that, we will have a relationship which has a critical mass, which means that whatever standards we create between ourselves are likely also to be picked up by other relationships which are smaller around the region as well. So from my perspective, some of that work, aside from the individual business things, which are very, very important, and the building of consortiums and so on, but some of that work around building standards and frameworks is something that it's really important for Australian and Japanese governments and businesses to become actively involved in, with a view to how we actually are setting up, a much broader kind of future in the region and as well for that trade.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, and if you've got any questions, I think there'll be a mic roving around, I think. So, we'll open up to the Kiya-san. If you could wait for the mic.
Thank you. I should have mentioned it a bit in my initial, but I like to point out that this is not a bilateral issue. It's Asia or Indo-Pacific initiative, because earlier this year, in January 2017, at the Japanese Diet, Prime Minister Kishida presented a vision of an Asia zero emissions community. And the next day, on the 18th of January, at Davos, Prime Minister Kishida presented the same idea, saying that, Japan and Asian countries jointly work for joint financing and joint investment, technological standardization, and emission market in the field of hydrogen and ammonia and others. So that vision has been presented at the Prime Minister's level. And I'm hoping that this will create the opportunity for Japan and Australia. So the Asian countries' situation in decarbonization is quite different from other parts of the world. And the divergent, different paths for decarbonization is quite important to ensure the pragmatic, realistic transition. And that will create huge opportunities for both our countries and our collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I've got way more questions I can go through. So yeah, maybe just put your hand up if you have any.
If I could just make
please.
one very quick comment on what Kiya-san's just said, because I, thoroughly agree and welcome that initiative from Prime Minister Kishida. The point I was trying to make is that Australia and Japan have very closely aligned interests within that overall regional situation. So having smaller bilateral dialogues as well can play a very positive role in supporting those kinds of regional initiatives, and would be in the interests of both our countries to look at that, I think, and particularly the involvement of business and a broader audience in developing those things.
Yeah.
Perhaps, if anyone else has any comments on that?
I was going to say, I wish I'd done better research, and maybe I can reissue the paper this afternoon.
Debra, I might move on to just questions about the supply chain difficulties and the geopolitical developments currently. What should businesses do now to prepare for working with and in Japan in this sort of uncertain economic times?
I'm going to, in the interest of time, I've already talked about working together, Japanese and Australians. And I think despite the difficulties and the challenges that both countries have had, we expect that they will recover, and opportunities will certainly by 2023 issues around even the threats of inflation and so on all going well will give us the opportunity to deepen and strengthen the relationships that have already been built. The issue for me that is relevant to today's talk is really around the opportunities in Asia for both of them to work together. And it goes to Kiya-san's comment, as well as joint leaders in Asia. I think that's where the opportunities to further expand their business opportunities, but also contribute to the stability and economic stability, but also the geopolitical stability of Asia. And when you think about Asia is obviously very diverse, but if we look in general at some of the trends that Asia has seen over the last couple of years and look to come out of this period of disruption, that they have. There's a much stronger sense of regionalisation in Asia, and it's Asia to Asia. And that sense of supporting each other and building that ecosystem is a great opportunity for Australia and Japan to grow themselves, but also to add to that stability. I think the other, Asia certainly ranks among the most innovative region in the world in terms of innovation, of course, with their demographics, their digital native youth. This is going to continue. And so the ability for us as partners, Japan and Australia, to work with Asia and to learn from Asia, not particularly to give to Asia, but to work collaboratively, is really great. I think also if you look at consumer growth driving business growth going forward, I mean, Asia has that not only huge consumer growth, but a demographic growing from low incomes consumers to medium to high consumers, and of course a lot of the other demographics that are changing among single households and diversification of consumer needs. That's going to drive enormous opportunities for Australia, and if we're working with Japan, we should be able to take advantage of that. And also Asia is one of the leading regions in investment in renewable energy. So once again, to our point today, the opportunities there are enormous. There's also always, often when you have these conversations, there's a bit of pushback about productivity in Asia. I mean, scale is one thing, but making those corporations in Asia more productive is something I think we can do with collaboration technology and using that scale and regionalisation. So I think the opportunities to come out of the challenges we've had working with Japan into Asia are enormous, and I'd encourage us to take that opportunity with gusto.
Unless there's any question from the audience, I might finish up with, would you? Oh, yes.
Hi, guys. Sorry, my name's Montana. I'm from JVIC. I just have a quick question about energy exports. So obviously in fossil fuels and traditional sources, Australia is very competitive. Do you think we will, I assume you maybe not, probably won't retain that competitiveness with new energy or renewable energy, in which case, how would that affect the relationship we have with Japan? Thank you.
I'll make a comment because I'm not an expert in that field, but I would say we can certainly challenge that concept of we won't be as competitive. We can be that competitive, I think.
I certainly, that was my initial reaction too, is, there are very good reasons why Australia should be able to be very competitive. If you're looking at hydrogen as an example, and I do actually want to come back to the point that was made before, that the clean energy transition is not all about hydrogen. When you talk about clean energy, especially with a lot of Japanese companies, you immediately get a sort of focus on hydrogen. It is potentially very important, but there are a whole range of other things as well. And so if you look at the critical minerals that are necessary for renewable energy, for example, Australia has very large reserves in a lot of cases, in one of the largest, if not the largest, resources of lithium, for example. We have a mining industry which is, world leading. And there's no reason why we wouldn't be very competitive as a source of lithium, and also a source of lithium which is politically stable and reliable. And if you look at the scale of our solar and wind potential resources as well, again, we would see no reason why Australia should not be extremely competitive. And I think that's what most of the international reports on this are saying. And with hydrogen, a third thing is that while we're a long way away from Japan, most of the other major potential sources of hydrogen are even further away from Japan. So again, I don't see why we would be expecting not to be competitive. But I do think there's also another point, which is we may have to rethink what energy trade actually looks like in a new world. And this is one of the reasons why, as I was saying before, we have this proposal that we need to have a strategic look at these things. We've been used to thinking that energy trade is about digging it up here, whacking it on a ship, sending it to Japan, and it gets burnt over there. It may well be that if you've got lots of iron ore in your country, if you've got the means of producing hydrogen relatively cheaply in a renewable way in your country, and if you know that exporting iron ore, which is big and heavy, and exporting hydrogen, which needs to be cooled down to very low temperatures or turned into something else to get it there, it may well be that the best way of trading that energy is to do more processing in Australia, where everything already is, and exporting the energy embedded in the finished product. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done around that particular thing as well.
I think it's a really insightful question, though, because I think we'll miss the opportunity if we don't recognise that, yes, we can be competitive, but it's going to look different. And we're going to have to do it differently. And we're going to have to work collaboratively in partnership, not simply dig up and sell. Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, Australia has a pretty poor record of doing anything but pick it up, put it on the ship. And our mining companies are, and that's the truth of it. There's an international survey, and in terms of, it's a measurement of the sophistication of the economy moving from primary. And I think we're 92 or 89 or something. So there's quite the mindset shift is quite dramatic. And, you see with BHP, Rio, they all did that in the past, weren't very good at it. They're very good at digging stuff out. So there's a lot to be done at the government level to set that tone and to sort of drive it and for business to embrace it. So I agree with all that, but
I think that's right. Just to sort of come back on that, though, but you know what we've and this is partly inherent in the change we're seeing in the region as well that you alluded to in the paper. We've been through a period when we've really had globalization has driven a very strong focus on efficiency and cost reduction and so on. And so comparative advantage has been a real driver. Economic comparative advantage has been a real driver of what we do where. If that comparative advantage changes, then it's quite likely. And providing, as Debra says, we're alert enough to the implications of that, we may find it becomes better to do some of those things. One of the reasons we are bad at some of the things you mentioned is that it didn't actually make economic sense to do those sorts of things here under the old paradigm. It might do under the new paradigm.
And that's why we're at such a critical time in economic history, I think, particularly in Asia. And that's why I think it's so important for Australia and Japan to grab the opportunity.
On that note, I think we're out of time, but the panelists will be hanging around in the networking. So if you have any questions, please approach them and ask questions there. So could I please get a round of applause to thank the panel once again, and for the Asian Society